All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's lecture. So welcome everyone to higher order functions. And this is a really important lecture because basically I'm just going to turn this off for now because we can turn it back on in a bit. If it gets too stuffy, just let me know. But this is a really important lecture because it's sort of conceptually, like this is how a lot of web applications work. This is JavaScript's ability to basically pass functions as arguments and return functions from functions really enables it to be like a powerful language for interactive websites, web applications, and it kind of drives like this event-driven system. And so we'll dive right in, but it is it's kind of funky, but at the same time, like it's really powerful, and it like enables JavaScript to be, even though it's like single-threaded, meaning it does only one thing at a time, it still allows it to have a lot of things kind of running in the background as it's doing one thing at a time, like having a sort of queue system. So I'll kind of get into that, but let's dive into the basics of what I mean by higher order functions. And basically in JavaScript, functions, they may look special because we call them, we invoke them, we do the curly brackets and we call them, and then we get that return value that they return, or we execute all the code inside of them. So it may seem like they're different than other values, but in reality, they're just values. And just like how you can pass a string as an argument into a function, you can also pass another function into an argument of a function. They're very, and once you do that, that function becomes like a callback. The term, the function becomes interchangeable with what a callback is. And so if you guys have used like for each, we'll go into for each and how that works and how that implements the callback concept. But yeah, functions, they're special in JS, but because they aren't special, meaning like they aren't really treated any differently other than the fact that they can be invoked, just think of them as a string or like a number or like an object that you can just pass around interchangeably. And that's what makes this language so powerful, because not every single language allows you to do something like that. So I've kind of alluded to all of this already, but just to reinforce it, we can pass functions just like we can pass any of these data types into functions. And we'll go over why that's so powerful in a few moments. They might seem different because they have that special function keyword. They have those curly brackets, but really they're just a value that you can pass around. And that's what's meant by this term first-class objects. It's just a way of saying that they're just like any other values in JavaScript. So again, this is something that we've all seen before. We're pushing this string into this array. But we can also push functions like these. If this was a function, as we'll see here, we can just push functions into arrays too. It's not that much different. Obviously, the difference here is that we're not calling it. If we called it, then we would pass the return value of this function into the array. Right now, this return value is nothing, so it would be undefined if we called it and then pushed it in. But right now, we're just passing the value. So technically, you can then iterate over this array and then start calling each element of the array because it's function. So much like a string or a number, we're pushing functions into the array. So when we log it, it'll just say function, 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 and we can then loop over this array and start calling them if we wanted to, like start invoking each element. So that's what they're doing. right here. They didn't really have to do this part, but like you can just have directly done the square bracket to access this element and then just call the function directly. But this is an extra step. It's just a little more clear since we're using a variable. But yeah, it's just an example to show that functions aren't that special. And just like how we can pass strings into an argument of a function, we can pass other functions. So this gives us a lot of flexibility here, because now we can pass functions into other functions and call them whenever we want. So it's like, let's say, we had a function called like bake a cake. Then we could have a function called grab flour, grab eggs, put them in the oven, whisk, all those functions, and just pass it into the bake a cake function and then call them from within the bake a cake function. So that might be something that might be useful. For example, this is just an example, but basically we're passing this function into this, and then when we log type of, does anybody have any guesses as to what this will log when we log type of in this particular instance? Yeah, it's a function, since we're passing into this function this value, and this value is the happy function, so it's going to be a function. And so when people say, yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question.
Huh?
So when you're passing that without the parentheses, can you explain how that's different than
with the parentheses?
Without calling it, I mean?
Yeah. So when I pass it without calling it, then I can call it within here. It's just that function as a value. It's not invoked. Like if I were to call it and pass it, then I'd be passing the return value, which is undefined because I'm not returning anything. So this would be undefined. But if I don't call it, then I'm just passing the function itself, and that can be called within here. I can pass it whatever arguments I like.
You're just saying this is this thing. It's like a placeholder.
Yeah, it's a placeholder, and later on I can call it. It's like gives me that flexibility of in this function I can call other functions that are passed to it, and it gives me the power to invoke it whenever I like. And so that's what drives like the event-based nature of JavaScript, is that you can pass all these functions around and on a certain event, because you don't want to call it right away. For example, let's say like you define the function and you're going to use it later, but you don't want to call it right away, so you pass it around to other places, and in those places, like only when you want to call it, then you call it. So it's like, yeah.
On line 11, if you put return console log I am happy, would that be considered calling it?
So that's a good question. I think console log itself is a function. So if you returned console log,
or if it was another function and you put return, or if it was a method and you put return in front of it.
So if this
would that be calling it?
So you're saying if this function returned another function?
Yeah, and
then called that function, or didn't call that function?
If you put return in front of the method that you're calling, does that
So are you saying that in this function I'm defining another function?
I just put return in front of console log I am.
Okay, so if you put return in front of console log, I think console log itself is a function, and so I believe that function doesn't have, like when you call it, I don't think it has a return value.
So it doesn't actually make the function do what it's supposed to do until.
I think it'll still call this. I think it'll still call it because you're invoking it. So it'll call it, it'll log it, but the actual value of this function, if you returned it, it would still be undefined, I think. But it'll still run this line, and it'll still log to your output because to your terminal because you're calling it. You're still invoking it right here. If you just did this, then it wouldn't log anything to the terminal. And then if you just return to console.log, I believe you can then, this return value, calling this function would just be the same thing as console.log because you're returning this, and now you can call whatever you return. So let's just do it. Let's see if it's a good time to try to do an example. So let's try it. I'm not 100% sure because console log. But let's see. Let's try it out. Function happy function, and it just console. So if we just returned console.log, then I'm pretty sure you could say so basically this became console.log because I'm not calling it, so it's not doing anything here because I'm not invoking it. I'm just passing the value of console.log. So this console log I'm now setting as the value of this invocation. So this is the same thing as console.log now.
Because of the return, that's why it says.
Yeah, because of the return. Now if I called this, then it would log, but you know, it's still log because I'm calling it now. But if I did console log, it would just give me an error because I already called this function, and so it's undefined, and I'm trying to invoke like undefined because console.log is itself a function that doesn't return anything. It just prints to the terminal. So this is very different than if you just did this. If you just returned this, and now you can use this as a console log because now this is just the function itself, not the return value of that function, which are two very different things. Are there any questions about that? It's kind of confusing, but yeah, this is a higher order function because it returns a function. We'll go over some more examples because I know this can be like kind of weird and we might wonder why we even want to do something like this, but this will make this language very powerful. So yeah, if you ever guys hear of higher order functions, it's just a function. If it takes a function as an argument, instead of a string, instead of an array, instead of an object, if it takes a function as an argument, call it a higher order function. Give it a fancy name. It's not really doing anything fancy though. It's just taking a function as an argument. And if it returns another function, then it's also called a higher order function. This is a fancy name for a function that takes a function or a function that returns a function. And that's very different from a function that returns an invocation of a function. If I'm invoking the function, if I'm returning the invoked function, then I'm not returning a function, unless that function is itself returning another function. So, yeah. So again, so I'm passing a function to this function, and within here, I have to call it if I want this function to be called. If I want to log I'm happy, and I'm passing it inside of this function, inside that function I have to call it, or else I'm not going to do anything with that. That function's not going to do anything. So yeah, if we want the function to run, we have to call it if we pass it in as an argument. So we'll go over a few more examples. So now, does anybody have a guess as to what this would log? take a moment to just look through it. And what do you think would be output into the terminal? Any takers? Yeah, it would just say hi Sadie. Perfect, because see, now this function is a little fancier. It takes in a parameter that's not a function, so this is just a string. Takes in a function here, but it's not calling it. So we have the flexibility to call it within this function, and we are calling this function. We're invoking it, which means we're gonna run this code, which means we're gonna call this function. Says hi. That's gonna be hi name, and we're passing the name in this way, and so it'll say hi Sadie. Great job. And now it'll say bye Sadie because you're passing a different function that says bye. Much the same idea. And we'll go over why this might be done in a bit. There are a couple more examples. Any guesses as to what this logs? Yep. Hello world. You guys are getting it. It's not it seems complicated, but when you name it like something like this, then it's a little more clear. Like it's a function. I'm passing it here. I'm gonna call it with this argument. And that function is defined up here, so we can follow the little trail, and then we get this output of hello world. And this function can be referred to as a callback function, because we're passing it in, and then later on we're calling it at any given point, whenever we want. Hello world. Now this gets a little more involved, but it's just more like navigating through the array structure now, so it's more just iterative. But anyone care to guess what this logs to the terminal? Yeah. Hello Jane, hello Jill, hello Pip, and hello Mike. It's a little confusing because like they're naming this hello, say hello with name, and then inside here it's called say with name func. So it's like it's kind of hard to tell, but once you pass this value into here, this becomes this variable. We're just basically storing this function. We're like reassigning. So like this function is called say hello with name, but we're reassigning it to this variable. And now when we call this, the same thing as calling this, we're just reassigning the name to this name. And we're just going through the loop of arrays, and we're passing each element of an array into this function. So yeah, just a quick side note is basically you can, here they define this function and they pass it in here, but you can just define that function within here too. So like you can just say, it would be the same thing as like, just put them side by side so you guys can see it. So you can just say to all group, and then here you can just say function, and you can define it within here too. You can give it a name too, like if you wanted. Doesn't matter. But you can, it's basically the same thing. Defining an anonymous function. Anonymous functions don't have a name. But basically passing in this function definition, or just defining it first and then passing it in, it's I mean, this way is more flexible because if you define it first, that means that later on you can use this in other places too. So that's why it gives you a little more reusability, because here you're defining it and then you can pass it in here, you can pass it into another function that takes in a function, you can pass it into another function that takes in a function. But here, if you did something like this, it might be a little weird to see, but if you defined it like this, you know, and then within the body you say like console.log blah blah blah. You can do the same thing and it'll still work because it's still passing it this function without calling it, because if I did this then I would be calling it, but I'm not calling it, so I'm just defining it. So it's kind of the same thing as passing it, but this is a little less flexible because like if there's other functions similar to say to all, like say to one or say to none, for example, then I couldn't reuse this function because it's scoped within this call, so I can't use it outside of it. So it would be probably a little better and more clearer to do it this way, to name it and then pass it in. But sometimes if you don't need to reuse it, then it might be just faster to just do something like this and create an anonymous function that has no name. If that makes sense. It's not reusable. You can't reuse this function anywhere. It doesn't even have a name, so you can't really call it because it's a unnamed function, anonymous function, but it's fast. Like you just quickly, you can even use arrow functions if you are lazy and like you don't. It's just like there's shortcuts, so to make it faster, but you can't call it in other places. So there is that shortfall. So you know, there's always a trade-off. You can start coding things faster. You don't have to like declare stuff, but then you can't reuse it. Or you can take the time to like type out the variable name, but later on you can reuse it. So whenever you sacrifice something, you gain something. Whenever you gain something, you sacrifice something too. So next, I mean, like, I guess they're doing the same thing here that I just did, where instead of passing the actual named function, they're just passing an anonymous function. But it would do the same thing. It would just say bye Jill, bye Jane, bye Jill, bye Pip, bye Mike. We can pass anonymous functions into other functions too. For calc, I mean, this one's just like plus minus operation func. So any guesses as to what this would log out? Structured a little funky. Any guesses? Yeah, it's 30. It's similar idea. They just try to put arguments on either side and then pass the function in between it. This is that function. You just match them up, argument to argument. And then this function is basically plus. And so they're just returning plus 10, 20, which is 30. And you're console logging that. So it'll print 30 to the terminal. Yeah, what's up?
Is it no to use like num1? So you see how function count and function plus both have num1 and num2 as the variables that you pass? Do you not need to assign anything using console log plus as the value because the variables are the same when you create functions?
You mean this variable and this variable?
You see how 10 plus 20?
Yeah. The order matters.
Like what? Yeah. But what they need, like if you rename the variables in function calc, like num3 and num4, would you need to add something after plus that you know to do?
So if you did num3 and num4,
Yeah.
then you would need to pass num3 and num4 here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it wouldn't. It would say num1 is undefined, num2 is undefined.
Yeah.
But here, num3 and num4 would just become num1, num2 within this function, because it's all like locally scoped. So within calc, 10 is num3, and 20 is num4. All these just have to match. Like within the body of the function, it has to use the same variable name as what's in the parameter.
Yeah.
But once you pass it in here, like num1 doesn't have to be num1. Like in here, this could be whatever you want, because this variable actually gets declared within the body of the function, like under the hood. So it's like the same thing as saying let num1 equals num1.
Yeah.
Within here, so this could be whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that your question, or was it?
I'm just kind of confused how you don't need to put anything next to plus in the console log, but it might be clear that we can do more stuff.
Next to plus?
Yeah, like,
Oh, because this doesn't.
because
You're not really calling it though. Since you're not calling it, and you're just passing it as like a value, you could essentially like later on you would still pass it, like it still takes 2 arguments.
Yeah.
But here you're not calling it, so you're just passing it as if it's just a string or any other data type. You're just passing it, and later on when you call it, what do you call it? Yeah, when you call it here, you pass it its 2 arguments when you actually call it. But when you're just passing it around, you wouldn't pass anything related to parameters. You just pass the name. That's a good point of anonymous functions, though, why they might be useful. Because at least with an anonymous function, like let's say instead of doing plus, you just pass in a function here. Like before with this anonymous function. Damn, yeah. This might be clearer because it's saying I'm passing a function that's taking 1 parameter, or you could say 2 parameters or 3 parameters, so it's more clear. But if you named it beforehand and you pass it in, then you don't know the function signature. So you have to like look at where it's defined and then pass it however many parameters that it expects by looking into the code and seeing where it's defined. Whereas if you just passed an anonymous function like this, then you automatically know off the bat like how many arguments it takes. So that's a good point, because I didn't even think about that, but that's another benefit of using an anonymous function, is that although you can't reuse this later on because you're not even giving it a name, and it's only scoped to like this function to be accessed within this function, you can't reuse it, but at least you know the function signature so that you know how many arguments it expects when you call it later on. So this function is called here. And so here, you're like, okay, this is a function, but I don't know what the function signature is. But if you look here, you'll know how many parameters that it expects to receive. Great question, great call out though, because it is kind of weird. Like I'm passing plus, I don't know how many, is this even a function? Like what is this thing? That's why JavaScript has its weaknesses too, because it's so flexible. You can do whatever you want, but it's like when you're reading someone else's code, let's say plus wasn't even defined here, like it was defined in a different file. Then here it's easy to look, oh, plus, okay, so this is a function. But otherwise you're like, what is this thing? Like in other languages, you have to say like, this is a type of function, like, or this is a type of string, or this is a type of array. But here it's like JavaScript, like do whatever you want. So plus.
In your example, you said, well, the function plus could be in any other file. Now, do you have to, on this page, refer to other files that you might be searching?
Like pulling from?
Yeah.
That's like a
what
more.
What if you have 1,000 different pages? Is it going to go, well, where's that function, and look through everything? Or
You
do
have to declare it up here.
reference?
So in the way top of the function, you have to say, my function plus is I'm pulling it from this file, and you give it the directory.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
okay.
You have to declare all your dependencies of this file up on top explicitly so that you can use it. But that's like a more advanced topic for down the line, but yeah, you have to declare it all at the top so you know where everything is coming from. So yeah, we went over this. So for each is the first, like, if you guys have used it before, or if you guys have come across .map, .filter, .reduce, it takes a function as a argument. So before we used to do like .slice and we pass in a number like 0 to 1, or we did other splice. We passed in a bunch of things that I don't remember off the top of my head. But for each, much like those functions, takes a parameter, but that parameter happens to be a function. So for each is a higher order function since it takes a function as its parameter. And you don't need to use for each. You could do everything with a for loop. But this is a real good shortcut. So for each calls the callback which is the parameter, the function that got passed into it, for each element in the array. So when for each calls the callback, it passes the current element as the first element of the callback. What am I even talking about? We have to go through an example. So this is a lot of JavaScript is going to look like something like this. It's a lot of arrays and using these methods because it's a lot faster and a lot less, like your code base will be a lot less long, so it'll be a lot shorter if you use things like this. But basically, you have a array and that has a for each method, just like it has slice, just like it has splice. It has a for each method, but this takes a function. So this function is defined up here. And so what it will do is basically this string argument is going to be Brooklyn, and then it's going to run again because it's like a little loop. And then the string is going to be Golden Gate, and then string is going to be London. It's like all happening like under the hood, like it's like implied almost, like this code. So if you just do a lot, if you look at it, the more you look at it, you'll just start picking up on these like implied things. But basically, it's implied that each element is passed into this function, and this function is called as many times as there are elements in the array. So log uppercase, like I could just say let bridges for let I equals 0, I is less than bridges.length, call this function in the for loop, but that's like pretty long. Like that's going to be at least like 4 lines of code. But it'll just all get accomplished in 1 line. And so what this does is it'll say, run this function for Brooklyn, run this function for Golden Gate, and run this function for London. And that stuff's like very common. Like you want to call a function on each element in a list without having to initialize a for loop and then like get your index of the array and then call that function. You could do the same thing. It's the same thing as a for loop, but it's just a lot. It's just a lot shorter. So, are there any guesses as to what this would log? Yeah, it will just go through the list. So you just think, look at this array. However many elements are in that array, it's going to call this function, passing that element as the argument to that function, and then just call it as many times as there are elements in the array.
Why don't you use two uppercase in there? Why don't you use lowercase?
Well,
oh, never mind. That's the function. Never mind.
Yeah.
I think that one's.
Yeah, this is the function that takes in this parameter, and then it's calling that function on here. So you need this function because it's what allows you to get access to string, or you could call this element item, but this is this. And this will become this, and this will become this in an iterative manner. Are there any questions on for each? It'll be something that we'll encounter very frequently, but here now this gets a little wackier. Another implied thing that just happens under the hood is that the first argument, if you just had string and you did bridges.forEach log in with index, the first element would be the element, but then there's a second argument that gets passed. This is all like under the hood. Like we don't see the arguments being passed, but it's happening. The second one is the index of that element. Just in case you wanted to do something with the index, it'll just give it to you for free. So here it'll, like this is just, like you have to look at the function signature of for each, again, the documentation, and it'll tell you all these things, like what arguments get passed to that function, like that's implied. But it's impossible to know this like without looking at the documentation of for each to know that it actually passes the second argument, which is the index. But yeah, I don't think it passes another one though. I think these are it. Yeah.
So they look like whatever you make the second argument, you could say string pancake, and pancake will just be the index, just underneath it automatically.
Yeah. Yeah. You can pass it whatever name you want it to be. So again, you could replace this with an anonymous function. So you could say something like I don't know if that's like the proper way to spell that name, but I don't know why that even came to my mind. But we have names.forEach, and then we could just say, function name. I call this whatever I want. Oh, is this italicized? Okay, whatever. I could call it name. I could call it I don't know what's like a synonym for name, but like item. I can call it element of array. Doesn't matter. I call whatever I want, and then I can say, and now this function is going to get called for each element. So if I just wanted to console log the name, I could just say like, hi, my name is name. And now when I run this, it'll say, hi, my name is Bob. Hi, my name is John. Hi, my name is Cecilia. And this is called an anonymous function. I could give it a name too, but that's redundant because I can't use, so if I said callback, right, it'll still work. I could give it a name properly, like how we properly learn how to define functions. But the reason why we don't do this really is because outside of here, I can't call this function. I can't. It'll be an error because this function is only scoped to be within this scope. It can't go outside. I mean, it can't go, scope doesn't go inside out. It goes outside in. So there's no point of giving this even a name because I can't call it anywhere else. So that's why there's no point of even bothering giving it a name. And that's why we make this function anonymous, because we can't even use it or reuse it. So we just usually skip the naming part. But if you wanted to make this a very reusable, if you wanted to make it reusable, then you could just do something like this and then pass it reusable. And now I can reuse this. So, you know, a little more work because I'm defining it outside, and a little weirder looking because I don't know, like if this function was defined somewhere else, like if I couldn't see it directly how its function signature was, and I just had this, it looks kind of weird. Like, what is reusable? How many arguments does it have? I'm a little confused. So that's why if you just do an anonymous function here, then you know exactly what the arguments are, however many it takes. Just back to your question about how funky this looks. But then again, it's reusable, so you can reuse it later on, which is nice. If I defined an anonymous function here, I would not be able to reuse it anywhere. And so another use case, I try to think of examples of how to make this useful, like why callbacks, why higher order functions. But there's a little example here of what like code might look like for a web app or some application. So this is a callback, and this is what like JavaScript files might look for a website. So like you have, oh, this is really big, but I'm sure you guys can see it. But like instead of emitter, you could just think like this is a button. And then you say button.on click. So it's saying it's an event listener. It's listening for the click event, like someone pressing a button. So it's listening. When this happens, I'm going to call this function. That's why callbacks are so useful, because like I don't want to just define a bunch of functions and then call a bunch of functions right then and there, because otherwise like I can make like a animation, like I'm calling all these functions, all these things are happening before me. But if you want to give the user control of your elements on a web page, then you have to listen for certain user interactions and then run your code after. So that's why you need to be able to pass functions as arguments, because you don't know when they're going to be called. They're going to be called not in your control, but in the user's control. So, you know, I'm just like emitting this event here, and then when I emit this event, then it's going to console log button clicked. So this is like a real life case of higher order functions doing really useful things, and like a web page is like filled with these, like on click, on scroll, on type, on submit. There's just a bunch of events, and then you handle those events by using functions. And this is an anonymous function, but it could be a named function. It could be, you know, you could define this function somewhere else and then pass it, just like how, you know, this could be like, and instead of this, I could just say, do something on click. Shit. Same thing. I define this function and I pass it like this, or I can pass it anonymous function like this. But that's just one example of why this is an important concept to internalize.
On line 13, you have emitter.emit. Is dot init a method in the window object that's available to us, or
It's not in the window object. I'm defining it up here. So it's
so
from.
dot, so when you say dot init,
It's a function.
referring to it's a function. It's a regular function in the window object.
Oh, I don't think it's on the window object. It's on the emitter object. Because I'm defining the emitter up here. Like, you don't have to think about like new for now, but
Why does that say dot init and the variable is called emitter?
I guess the emitter is an object that has an emit method on it. So it's just like a giant object. So this is like your blueprint, and then this like creates an object that you can use, and then here you're calling it, and then when you call it, you have like a listener that's listening for this event, and so it'll when it emits, something's listening, it hears it, and then it triggers this function,
Okay.
which
so
is
dot
the
init
callback function.
basically calls whatever it's attached to it in a normal situation. I'm not familiar with dot init.
Yeah. No, you don't have to be familiar with .emit. I was just you don't have to be familiar with emitter, events, none of this stuff. This is just an example. Like, I just try to show you like callbacks and like why it's useful. Cause like otherwise, like we're like looking at all these weird examples like log hello, like, but this is a real thing where a web page is just full of listeners listening for user interaction, and then once someone types, press submit, runs a function. Everything is a callback basically on the web page. Like, it's just functions waiting for you to do something, and it's not like functions that I'm defining and then calling, defining and then calling, defining and then calling right there on the page. It's me defining functions, passing them as arguments, and then waiting for the user to do something to then trigger the function to be called. And yeah, this is an example of something that's defined somewhere else. So the code that returns this object, like, it's defined in some other file, and this is usually how you like pull something from other files. But that's just like something that you don't have to think about. But I just wanted to point out when I keep saying like, oh, what if this was defined in another file and you didn't know what the signature was? Let's see. I think we're almost done with this lecture. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. But again, we can pass functions into other functions and then use those functions in other functions, call them whenever we would like, gives us that flexibility. And then just know that like for each takes a function as a parameter, and it like implicitly passes parameters which are the element of the array and the index of that element into the callback function that's passed into it. Yeah, that is today's lecture. I'm going to turn this. Thank you for bearing with me in this heat. I'm going to turn this bad boy back on. And then I'll pair you guys off. Feel free to take a break. There's like, so I'm not sure, but there's an optional project where if you guys have the time, this is optional, but if you guys are curious, there's like once you do little projects, like that's how you really are able to maximize learning. So if you guys want to check out this project, sounds pretty funny. Like you can, apparently it uses some chain to turn text into poems, or like, I'm not sure actually, haven't done this, but if you go on LearnDot to the workshops, then you guys would be able to find it. So yeah, and apparently there's some pretty interesting wacky things that can come out of this program just like gives you an output, spits you out all these random words, I'm assuming. But just something to take a look at if you guys have the time. If you guys don't, then just feel free to just keep chugging along these exercises. That's the more important thing, but this is just something if you guys are interested in learning more. It'll definitely be an interesting exercise. But yeah, feel free to take a breather. I'm gonna pair you guys off. And again, if you guys are confused at any point, just raise your hand. I'll be here to answer any questions you guys have. But for now, we'll do some workshops.